All right. Welcome back to Everyday Elevations, the podcast where we transform ordinary moments into extraordinary outcomes. Today, I'm really excited because I had a chance to talk to this individual earlier, and there's a lot of very interesting things that we're going to discuss today revolve around the brain and how your brain works. So the person who we're going to have on today is going to be Kimberly Jarman, and she is a mental performance coach who's passionate about empowering women to overcome self-imposed limitations and achieve their full potential. So in this case, she uses her master's degree in counseling to help integrate mindset, neuroscience, and biochemistry, thus helping clients build resilience, their confidence, and to pursue their dreams. Her mission is to guide women in achieving top leadership roles and living impactful lives on their own terms. In this case, she envisions a future where women lead boldly and leave a lasting mark on the world. So that was a whole mouthful. Just want to make sure I gave you a proper introduction. But with that, anything I missed, please feel free to let the listeners know. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background, what got you into all of this.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really wonderful introduction. Thank you very much for that. My background, yeah. Like in the coaching world, they talk about like you end up coaching like who you were, right? Like who you coach the things that you needed, right? So I've always been a high achiever. Like I'm the oldest in the family, right? The 4.0 student. Like you told me I was supposed to go to college and I was supposed to get a master's degree and I was supposed to get married and right. And I did that. But yet I found that I was like extremely disillusioned with my life by the time I was 35. Like by then I was working in a full-time job and I'm like, is this it? Like, this is going to be the rest of my life. Like, I am not at all like happy. I'm like, this is not what I was promised life was going to be. And kind of in that suffering and that misery, I burned my life down and just created like this dumpster fire of a life. And so I had to like find my way out of it. And then that's like where I found my coaching journey took me is like doing my own work, my own self-healing, finding tools that actually work for me because so many things didn't. And that's how I kind of became the coach I am today is like, because I was the coach that I needed back when I was 30, 32, 34, 35 years old that I just could not find out there.
So let me ask you this. Being that you did all this research to figure out what worked for you, how'd you go about searching for all of that? Were you testing coaches, like things like that? Or like, how'd you go about it?
Kind of the way my personality is wired is like, I'm an action taker, right? Like, I'm not like, let's sit around and theorize this crap, right? Like, just let's take some action, like find out does it work or not, and then we'll go from there, right? And so my master's degree is in counseling. I'd been in the therapy world as a client for almost 10 years, and it wasn't working for me. I wasn't getting happy. I wasn't becoming happier. I was still struggling with anxiety and some depression. Long story that I won't take. I ended up in the psych hospital for suicide. Because it wasn't working. And I think at that point, what really I learned in that was like, you know what? Like, no one's coming to save me. No person, no God, like no one's coming to save me. If I want a different life, it's all on me. And so I love reading and I was reading books and I was reading this one book by Jen Sincero, You're Badass at Making Money. And basically that book was like, if you want to be successful and stop living paycheck to paycheck, like you've got to hire a coach. And I was like, I don't know what that is. Like, where do you find that? So I Googled it, found a podcast, Life Coach School podcast, listened to 2 episodes. This is a perfect example of how I operate. Listened to 2 episodes and then signed up. And I was like, well, we're just going to try this out and see if it works. And it was life-changing for me. So I studied under her for a couple years and like it was changing. It was life-changing for me. But at that point, I was like, how are all these people like super like multi-millionaires? Because Brooke makes like $52 million a year in her business. And so I became really, I know. Yeah. I became obsessed with like, okay, I know how the human brain works now. And I know that our thoughts chemically create our emotions, and our emotions drive our actions, and our actions create the results in our life. So if we want different results, we have to have a different thought, right? That's like the chain of command: thought, emotion, action, results. And I'm like, well, why is it that I'm not a multimillionaire, right? Like, what makes those people different? Like, what makes Elon Musk different? Why is he different from me? If we're all operating under the same model. And my business partner, she's a licensed naturopathic doctor. We were doing a podcast episode, and she just looks at me. She's like, "Oh, well, it's because of serotonin. Like Elon serotonin is somewhat regulated because serotonin is a self-confidence chemical. And if we don't have like regulated serotonin levels, it's really hard to access self-confidence, and it's really hard to have rejection resilience." And I was like, what? She's like, well, people that don't have regulated serotonin levels, like rejection's devastating for them. Failure's devastating. And they'll spend, for a while in that, versus people that have regulated levels. Like, yeah, it sucks that speaking about Elon, right? Like, it sucks that my rocket ship blew up in midair, and that was I think it's over $1 million $100 million something per rocket. But he's like, okay, we'll go back to the drawing board, right? I was like, okay, that's what's missing. There's just a lot of me, to answer your questions the long way there. It's a lot of me like trying things, and like that worked, that didn't work. And then trying some more things, and that worked and that didn't work, to like come to find my way is how,
Okay.
I got it.
Well, so you mentioned something interesting, the fact that Elon and some of these higher achieving entrepreneurs regulate their serotonin levels. How does one go about regulating that and figuring out what their serotonin levels really are?
I'm going to try to find like a non like extensive science way of describing this. So our body, like if you look at it from a naturopathic perspective versus the allopathic perspective, which is conventional medicine, our body's always trying to move to a state of health, right? We usually have to get out of its way, and we have to supply it the nutrients it needs to get there. So when you look at serotonin is a precursor to melatonin. Okay. So you will know probably if like I'm not sleeping well, then my serotonin levels are either off or it's not converting well into melatonin. Right. So that's kind of the first like signal. But also serotonin, when we have the Goldilocks syndrome in our body, like it has to be just right. Right. If we have too much serotonin, it feels like anxiety in our body. If we have too little serotonin, it feels like anxiety in our body. So it has to be in this like perfect kind of like window. And a lot of it is stress resilience. We can't get away from stress, but we have to change our perception around the world to reduce our perceived stress. Okay.
Talk to me a little bit more about that too. I figured you were just about to before I interrupted you.
No, you're okay. Stress is always happening, but most of the time we feel chronic stress, it's because of our perception about the world. We're perceiving things as threats, or we're perceiving things from like scarcity or lack. And so then our brain labels this event outside of us as stressful.
Makes sense.
Okay. So we have to be able to start managing our mind in a way that we are not perceiving all these things going on around us as stressful. So we create more of a stress resilient state. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me.
Okay. So the reason I kind of had to turn off on that tangent real quick and come back to your serotonin question is because stress, we all know, is cortisol, right?
Yep.
Okay. Well, stress is a hormone. So our sex hormones like testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, which you as a male also have, right? We just have it in different quantities. Progesterone is the precursor to cortisol. So progesterone's here, it converts into cortisol, This is fairly basic, high level, right? And then progesterone then also converts down into our sex hormones, which is testosterone and then the 3 estrogens. When we're living in chronic stress, the demand for our sex hormones, progesterone, is going to be prioritized to cortisol. And it's going to downregulate our other sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen. Well, testosterone and estrogen, or estrogen specifically, is correlated with dopamine, right? So it messes up the whole system when we're in chronic stress.
Interesting. Okay. No, please keep going.
Yeah. So, because we're demanding cortisol all the time. So the body's going to stay in chronic stress, which is going to stay in fight or flight all the time, which is a high demand for cortisol. So then we're going to down regulate because your body thinks that you're being chased by a lion. That's like, it can't delineate like my boss is an asshole versus there's a lion trying to eat me. It can't separate that. It's just a threat to our survival. So when we're staying in that chronic stress, our body is then prioritizing cortisol production, adrenaline production, and down regulating production of serotonin and dopamine because it's like, we don't need to feel good. We don't need to have self-confidence right now. Primary function is to get away from that lion and death.
Okay.
Is that?
Yeah, it's very scientific, but I understand where you're going with it. So I appreciate the in-depth explanation too. It just makes it more fascinating for me. I'm sure the listeners.
Yeah. So then you asked me like, testing it is not, we don't recommend doing blood tests. So in my coaching program, we test all of my clients when they come in. So what we recommend is finding you're probably going to have to go to a functional medicine, naturopathic doctor to do a saliva and urine test. Because that's going to tell us how much is in the system, but how much you're actually utilizing. Or blood test won't tell you that. Blood test just says this is how much is in the system, but it doesn't tell us like, well, am I utilizing serotonin or is it like, what's going on with my serotonin?
Okay. So yeah, I would have thought it was just blood work, but guess that makes sense. Okay. Interesting. So now I definitely want to get this tested because I'm very curious. But that's a side note tangent, but please keep going.
Okay. So then you asked me like, well, how do we address it? Well, we start addressing our perception, our stress resilience by our perception of stress, right? But also people hate this answer, but it really is all about the quality of foods that you're intaking, right? Because those are the micronutrients the body needs to create these chemicals. Vitamin C, we need vitamin C. It's needed to make cortisol, but it's also needed for the dopamine conversion process from L-dopa into dopamine. So if we're not intaking a lot of vitamin C, then we're not giving our body the nutrients it needs to actually create these neurotransmitters along with other things it needs. So it's like food, quality of food, right? Water, sleep. Sleep has a huge role in us regulating our hormone production, regulating our neurotransmitter production. And the whole argument to get a little more sciencey, which you're like, okay, like people talk about genetics. Well, genetics is on the other side of creating these neurochemicals. They're enzymes, right? Well, we know now from genetics, it's a epigenetics things. Like it's a light switch. You either you have it, but it can be turned on or off, right? So when we talk about mental health and you're genetically born predisposed to whatever, let's just say bipolar, that's not the full story. You're born with the light switch. We can turn it on and off, and we can also get the body to do what it needs to do to turn it on or off, right? Because let's just say bipolar, sorry, I know this is a tangent, but bipolar is a dysregulation of dopamine. That's it.
So if you can properly regulate it, then you can mitigate the bipolar disorder. Interesting. Because we like to throw medication and everything and say it's going to fix it, but that just treats a symptom versus the actual problem. All right. That's actually fascinating to me, just because of the fact that I wouldn't expect that you could reverse something like that, mostly because I'm just admittedly a little ignorant to the science behind that. So that's cool. Okay. So by just simply, and of course I realize this, your diet is so critical to everything we do along with hydration. Of course it would affect the way that you react to things mentally and physically and how your body recovers from everything. So that makes perfect sense. I had a question, but that just completely left my mind here.
Very good. So how this like ties into like mental performance, right? And our potential and like high performers is like, it really starts with the mindset and like our awareness of our thoughts, like, because our thoughts are creating our reality. Because like we go back to the model, our thoughts are chemically creating our emotions. And as human beings, we're driven by our emotions, right? Like we're taking action or inaction from our emotions. And then that action, inaction is creating the results in our life. It's like we have to start with being able to have awareness in our mindset and understand that we have 10 to 60,000 thoughts a day. And most of those thoughts are the same thoughts that we've had from decades, right? And they're not based in facts because our brain is wired to like fill in the gaps, to do predictions, right? And it creates stories. So most of the thoughts that we think are reality are just stories that our brain is like circulating. So how I like to coach my clients is like, okay, let's take this thought that you have. Let's evaluate it. Where are the facts? Facts are provable in a court of law, or all 8 billion people will agree on it. If it's not 8 billion people agreeing or not provable in a court of law, it's not a fact. It's a subjective interpretation of reality. It's a story that your brain has created.
So what you recommend them do is work on story framework within their thought process. So basically just not retelling, but I guess essentially kind of like retelling the story, but in a different way, in a more constructive way.
Yeah, a way that serves you. Like, does this thought serve me? Does it not serve me?
And so it's interesting when people, because this isn't the first time I heard this, like the reframing of the thought process. But how do you get to a point to where you constantly do that? Because what I find is every day I'm working on reframing my mindset and things, because I'll find where I react negatively in a way that I probably didn't need to. Let's use driving in traffic, for example. Who doesn't get annoyed when they're driving in traffic, right? But how I react to it isn't always healthy. And it's hard for me to consistently switch my mind to say, hey, look, this is not that important of a thing. You're not really being that affected by it. There's good news is you're getting home, like whatever positive framework to put in there. Sometimes I just don't get it. So how does one work towards consistently being able to reframe their brain in a positive way?
For me, I think it's understanding that most of the things that I'm thinking and believing are not based in facts. They're stories. And then I also understand that all of my emotions are not created by the other humans. Whatever emotion that I am currently feeling, we're going to use your example of driving, right? And let's say like this guy like cuts you off and you're like, or whatever, like, yeah, let's just say he cuts you off. And so you're mad, right? How we're taught is that you're mad because of that guy's actions. Correct?
Yeah.
That's not true. You're mad because of your story about how another driver behaved. And that story created the anger.
Okay.
So I like to use this example. Like we have we call it manuals. I call it manuals in my coaching practice, right? And I learned that from my mentor. We have manuals of how all the humans should behave. You have a manual of how your partner should behave, your kids should behave, how the drivers on the road should behave, the people at Walmart should behave. But nobody has read your manuals. And we get so upset because they are not behaving how our manuals read. So the example I use is like Walmart. I have a manual that the humans should put their shopping cart back up into the trolley receptacle place where shopping carts go, right? And like when they leave it in the parking lot, like I found myself getting really mad at them. But here's the deal. I'm the one sitting in my car mad. Karen has drove off and is already in the McDonald's line at this point, happily moving on with her life. So I have a decision at that point. Like I can either keep that manual and be mad at Karen, and I have to deal with that emotional state, or I can just see like, this is my manual. Now, what do I want to do with this? Like, if it bothers me enough, then I go put the shopping cart up, or I just leave it there and drop my manual. And how this, like, I just emphasize it even more, like, I have a family member that has a very different manual. Their manual says leave the shopping carts out because that's job security for somebody else.
Ooh, interesting. So I'm actually, in your example, I'm very similar to you in the sense that shopping cart, I just go push it back. It's the OCD, and I'm like, like 3 steps away. Come on. So it's interesting thinking about. I love that the fact you call it a manual and how each person has their own. Because a lot of times we're not thinking about how somebody else does something differently, and yeah, maybe it is job security for somebody by leaving the cart out there. Although the skeptic in me would be like, yeah, that's probably not why they left it. But at the same time, you can reframe it in such a positive way. Like, hey, this is actually helping somebody make sure that they're going to get paid and be able to provide for their family.
Well, it's just my manual, right? Like I just recognize like, oh, this is my manual. Like that's my manual of how that driver, like I labeled it that they cut me off. Like that's my manual. This says drivers shouldn't drive like that. Maybe the person that cut you off didn't realize they cut you off, or like there was something going on that they caused, or they don't even deem it as cutting you off. Like that's how they drive from where they came from, right? But you can see how the two manuals are like, my manual's making me suffer. So what am I going to do with it?
That makes sense. Yeah. So, okay. I'm loving this, by the way, because this is kind of blowing my mind a little bit. I knew our conversation was going to be along these lines where you're going to just completely blow me away with information that should be rather, to me, I feel like it should be rather common knowledge, but it's not. And the way you break it down is super thorough and simplistic at the same time, so where you can actually digest it. That's why I love when you mention the manuals. I'm like, okay, I know what you're talking about. Even if I don't understand the exact science behind every aspect of what you're saying, I love that you break it down this way. These manuals are something that I know I'm going to use for probably the rest of my life thinking about it, because I know that there's moments in life where I just react in a negative way in my head. I'd create, like you said, create a story. Like I'll get mad for no reason because dishes weren't put away in my house. I shouldn't say no reason, but at the same time, it's not a good reason to get upset. It's kind of ridiculous, but because who I am, I go ahead and I get upset. I'm like, well, why aren't they respecting me? Blah, blah, blah. But the reality is they have a different manual. So I love that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, okay. So I'm trying to think where we're going from here at this point in the conversation. We went down this rabbit hole and I love it. How else can someone improve themselves with this, with changing their mindset, especially because you talked about the emotions aspect? The manual seems to be a key portion of that, just understanding who you are as a person and that every other person is not going to be you. Were there any other toolkits that maybe you teach your clients to help regulate their emotional aspect of their emotions, I should say?
Yeah. So I think a lot of us, for me, especially in the beginning of my journey, I just thought my emotions were created by the other humans, right? And so then the way around that was either I have to control the other humans and they need to behave the way I want them to behave so I can feel differently. That was option one, and that never worked for any human that has ever existed on the planet. Or option two was like, I just have to learn how to control my emotions. Like I'm going to feel anger because of the humans. Like, how do I control this emotion? And like that, it didn't seem effective for me. Like I couldn't really like master that skill set. So when I learned that like all emotions it's a chemical reaction in your body. It's an energetic reaction. Okay. Like, you can like go into the science of what like anger is, combination of dopamine and adrenaline, right? Whatever. But let's just say it's a chemical reaction that's an energy in your body. It's the way that the body communicates to the brain and the brain communicates to the body. And research shows that if people, we are not taught this skill set, so I acknowledge that. But the research shows that if people will sit down or stand up or walk, basically just be present with the emotion that's chemically going on in their body. Let's say anger, okay? Or let's use a different emotion. Let's say shame. So if you are like aware, like I feel something in here, like I'm feeling shame, like, and I'm aware of it and I'm conscious of it. And I'm like, where do I feel this in my body? The research says that that emotion will last for 90 seconds before it chemically dissipates out of the body. But we don't have the skill set to do that, right? We don't know what to do with shame. We just know it feels terrible. So then we try to like distract ourselves away from it by other activities, scrolling, eating, Netflixing, whatever, so I can feel a different emotion, or we suppress it down. So what we're doing is like we're pushing that we're storing that energy into another place in the body. I don't know if you've read the book, The Body Keeps a Score. He talks a lot about that. He's a physician.
No, but now I'm writing that book down. So
it's a dense book and it's heavy, but it does do a good job of talking about like how if you don't move that energy out of the body, it's going to be stored. And that stored energy then ends up really what we see, creating disease.
That makes sense. I've noticed when I harbor feelings, like I don't actually address them, I just kind of shove them down, is when, especially if something frustrates me, I'll know moments I'm like, ooh, clearly I was holding on to stuff for too long. So you get like this feeling in your chest, like a ball of anger. So it makes sense what you're saying. That's cool. Oh my God. My mind is getting blown left and right in this conversation because these are things that I don't really think about too much or try to address too much, even though I know I probably should. So this is why I was excited for the conversation with you, because you're bringing a whole different aspect to this podcast than what I normally interview or really talk about in general. So I am loving this. Please keep telling me more.
Yeah, thank you. And they don't, right? Like I had never heard any of this stuff. And again, I have a master's degree in counseling. None of this stuff was ever taught to me. So I just want to validate that. Like this isn't common knowledge and we're not taught these things. I don't know why. Like I think humanity would change if we had these tools, but that's a different conversation. I want to circle back to like processing emotion. Like what does that actually look like? Okay, if it's a chemical reaction in the body, right? It's an energetic force in our body, then like it's all about just processing it. And what does processing mean? Acknowledging it. Like not being afraid of it. It's a chemical reaction. It's going to be here and it's going to be gone, right? Like we're not going to get stuck in it. The only reason we get stuck in emotions is because we're repeating the story over and over and over and over and over, right? Like, go ahead.
I was gonna say, you mentioned acknowledging it. Is it something where you're telling yourself, hey, I'm feeling anger and trying to figure out why you're angry, or hey, I'm feeling ashamed and trying to tell yourself
you don't even
why?
have to figure out the why. You don't have to figure out the why. It's like, oh, okay. What is this emotion in my body? I'm learning new vocabulary. I feel like this feels like shame. All right. Where do I feel the shame in my body? I feel it like, I don't know, let's just say your chest. All right. I'm just going to, it gets to be here. I'm going to welcome it. Shame, you get to like expand within me. You can feel this body up. Like I'm welcoming it. It's welcome here. I'm not going to resist it. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to breathe through it. I'm going to acknowledge that it exists. It's here, right here and now. I'm allowing it. And then can I let it go? Would I let it go? When am I going to let it go? It's that simple.
Okay. That's cool. See, these are things that, again, just little amazing tips that people don't really have. As you said, it should be common knowledge, but we don't, especially as men, we don't talk about emotions very often. It's something I'm trying to get better about myself. Being prior military, I was always had to be gung ho, super strong, invincible, run through walls, no questions asked. And we weren't taught to address things that are upsetting us or things are impacting us emotionally. So like getting this information is huge. I know it's going to help a lot of people. I know I do have a bit of a veteran audience just because, friends and family and stuff. So I think this is going to help without naming any of them.
I used to work with veterans and I have like a soft spot in my heart, right? Because like, again, I'm a person, there's paperwork that says like PTSD and I did my run in the psych hospital for suicide. So I have an affinity towards that. But it's like we went from 22 veteran suicides a day, right? To now we're at, in the last 3 years, it's up to 31. Like the system isn't working. It's broke. So something I want to offer you guys in your veteran population is like you guys were trained to live in the primal brain. And when I say primal brain, that's like the survival brain, which is fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So the programming is all about like staying in that hyper like survival state and staying in the fight part of that state, right? Because that's what war is about, right? And so that's a constant dump of adrenaline and cortisol. But they missed the piece of like telling you guys how to then go from we call that dysregulated. It's a dysregulated nervous system state. It's like constantly staying in fight or flight. But they forget to teach you how to re-regulate, how to take your nervous system and move it back over into the parasympathetic state, which is rest and digest. To get there, though, we have to be able to acknowledge the emotions and the chemical reactions and process through them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes too much sense, actually. Being that I do suffer from PTSD, as soon as you mentioned it, I was like, yeah, it's true. We didn't really, you when you deploy, you are in that fight or flight. It's constantly, your head's on a swivel. And it doesn't matter if you're in a battle test area, let's say use Iraq, for instance, or if you're sitting in Qatar where there's really no attacks happening, your mindset's still in the fight or flight because you're deployed, regardless of where you're at. And when you're gone and isolated from your friends and family, you have a hard time getting back to the proper mindset. So I think this is really cool, and it makes perfect sense as to why, especially military members. I imagine this works similar for like firefighters, police, basically emergency responders would have similar things too. It's just you're constantly in that fight or flight mode. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to give to I don't want to be dismissive of this piece, right? So when you're constantly in that fight or flight mode, dysregulated is the word we're going to use, right? Like, so that's in your sympathetic nervous system. And when you're there chronically, then that's where the body's learned to stay. And so then it starts perceiving everything as threats. So then we come back home and your brain is still wired to perceive everything as threats, even though you probably logically know, like, this is not a threat, but your brain is now wired. No, everything is a threat. I'm just going to be bold and say it how I want to say it. When we try a top-down approach, top-down means like talk therapy, right? Or like just mindset work, right? Like we're going to try to fucking think our way through this shit, right? Sorry, you're a veteran. I'm like, well, I know how we talk in that world. It doesn't work because the body is now like the nervous system is kind of in charge. So top down doesn't work. You have to do a bottom up approach. Bottom up means is you start with the body to teach it how to regulate. Then we can go to the mindset piece. So bottom up approaches are like hydrotherapy, cold exposure, right? Bilateral stimulation, which is part of the EMDR kind of world. Breath work, working out, exercise, right? What's another one that I found really effective for me? I love the Sedona method. And that's like another one. So it has to be, you have to approach the body first and allow the body to start regulating the nervous system. And then you can start the top down approach with like the mindset or the therapy.
Okay. And what you're saying is that we typically have it wrong. We try with the mind first versus correcting the issues going on in the body. Because once the body's recovered, then you can recover the brain. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Because like, I'll just give you an example so we can get a little out of the sciencey part. Sorry. Because I have told you my path, right? So my nervous system has a hard time being regulated. Like it naturally, because of trauma and life, it wants to stay dysregulated. It wants to stay in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So recently, because I'm working with a guy that does lymphatic drainage and muscle testing, he uses the Activate method. You can just write those words down, research them, right? But what we found is like, I have a Garmin and my Garmin measures my stress all the time. And while I'm working here in my home office, my stress was staying high. And we found that my body, not my brain, okay? I'm not having any thoughts about this. It's my body. My body perceives this microphone in front of me and this screen in front of me as a threat. So my body's constantly like wanting to be in fight or flight mode because of this is in front of me.
Gotcha.
Like I can't get therapized on that, right? Like I can't like, can you just like talk to me about like this microphone in front of me? Like it's not a top-down approach. It's like I have to teach my body like it is safe to be in front of this. It's safe to be seen.
So what are some ways that you teach yourself? Like I know me personally, I meditate and I do breath work before I hop on these podcasts to get me a little more calm. Because I have a Whoop watch, so a little different than Garmin, but also same concept. Yeah, it tells me, oh, you were in the high stress zone for 24 minutes. I'm like, I just did a podcast.
Yeah. See, like I love this. Like this is a perfect example that we're talking about, right? It's a body, like your body's perceiving stress, and your mind is like, no, this is like fun. I like doing podcasts.
Yeah. So how do you regulate that? Like, how do you fix? Is it like things like I mentioned, where it's like meditation, kind of getting your body in the right comfort zone type thing? Or I also do contrast therapy too.
Yeah, like meditation, breath work, tapping. Tapping is really helpful for some people.
What's tapping?
Tapping is part of the emotional regulation therapy. EMFT or something. I can't remember. You can like YouTube it, tapping. But it's like you're tapping on certain points on the body as you're like rewiring the neural pathway. Like I'm safe sitting here in front of the computer. Yeah, sometimes it's hard to show up and be seen, right? And it's like it's creating safety within the nervous system and the brain. It's starting to co-regulate them.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize I was doing it during some of my meditations. So I just use Jay Shetty's Genius app for meditation. He does stuff like that. And I just never realized that's what he's doing.
Yeah, also, but you're using the physical exercise of tapping, and there's certain tapping points on the body. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a mixture. He do like tapping or like massaging certain areas. And so it makes sense. I just had no idea that's what was going on or why it came out so calm and like in just a better place mentally after that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Walks are super regulating to the body. Being in nature.
Yeah. Perks of being in Colorado. I like to hike in the mountains. It's very hard to not smile when you have so much beautiful scenery around you, and not to be in a good mindset. I do that. Well, now that the weather's picking up, I'm going to be doing it more regularly. Once it gets wintry out, I'm not trying to slip on ice. I'm a clumsy guy, so I don't get too adventurous with it. But summertime, I'm hiking every weekend. Just a great way to start your day off. I like to do it before the sun rises. So as I'm hiking, it comes up. And then I could just get that sun beating down on me. Yeah. Also just makes you feel like you did so much more in the morning in the first place. So
yeah. I think the science shows now you're like waking up in the morning and the first thing to do is like go out and sit and look at the sun, but like not look at the sun, like have sun like in your face basically. Cause then it's starting to work on your circadian rhythm.
Yep.
Right. When the sun's shining in the eyes. Yeah.
See that sciencey part I knew.
Yes.
Just because I was worked on regulating my sleep for the longest time. So I went down a deep, dark rabbit hole, figure out some of the things that I was doing wrong potentially and how I can correct some of my sleep. And then I decided to throw a 4-month-old into it. And that's all out the window anyways.
Right. Yeah.
But before that, I had amazing sleep pattern.
Yes.
But
Hydrotherapy, another great one. So like, like cold plunges, cold baths, cold showers, but something simple and easy. Like if you're doing a work day, it's like pouring ice water over your wrist. Because that helps like stop the nervous system for a minute, like to give you a pause and like, okay, we're kind of dysregulated. Like let's move over into like a more parasympathetic state. So that's a great like technique as well.
interesting. Okay. Yeah, I'm writing that down. I'm sure I'm going to get questions when I'm start pouring cold water over my wrist at work, but whatever.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, all right. So we're kind of getting close to the end time here. With that, I do like to ask a couple questions before we wrap it up. But first and foremost, if there's anything that you didn't get a chance to touch on, I want to give you the opportunity to talk about that. And then we can go into questions after.
No, I mean, I think we like covered a lot of things. Like it's really about awareness and like managing your brain, processing through your emotions, and then regulating your nervous system.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I know you think you made it really sciencey. I promise you, it's very digestible. If I can get it, I feel like most people can,
Good.
especially with my severe ADHD, where if I get lost and I'm just completely lost in the sauce, but I was tracking for the whole entire conversation. So I think there's going to be a lot of tips that are going to really help people because there's things that, like we both said, that we don't commonly talk about. So that's really why I wanted to get you on here after our first conversation. Like, oh, we have to do a podcast. You can't say no. But I'd actually love to get you on again on a side note, but we could do conversation another time about that. With that, it's a question I always love to ask people is the first one being, if you could be known by any quote or just any quote that really resonates with you, what would that quote be?
That's a great question. I love this quote. It's by Maya Angelou. When people show you who they are, believe them the first time. The second quote I love, you asked for one, I'm going to go for two, because that's who I am. I'm extra. The second one comes from Byron Katie. And she says, when you argue with reality, you lose, but 100% of the time.
Ooh, those are both really good. I mean, I knew once you said Maya Angelou, I was like, oh, that's going to be a fire quote because that's all she has are just really good quotes. Interesting. I love it. Mine's way less in depth. It's just my favorite quote is by one of my mentors, Jesse Itzler. Just be where your feet are. I have a very hard time staying present.
Of course you do. Like when you told me you have ADD, ADHD, that's a norepinephrine issue. So of course you do.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Yeah. So it's funny because when he told me that quote, I was so mad when he told me that because he kept saying it out loud. And this is a tangent on here, but we did a obstacle course and at a mountain camp that he set up for basically an adult day camp. And he was using mindset techniques that we learned before. And I don't know, was I 12 miles into that point? And he's like, be where your feet are. I'm like, if I hear that one more time, I'm going to tackle you. I was like, I know where my feet are and they hurt. But all he's saying was like, just enjoy the moment. It took me probably like 2 years after that to really grasp what he was saying. Like, just be here. Don't worry about what you have to do after or what went wrong prior to. Just enjoy that moment in time because you don't get a second moment like that.
Yeah, and the past and the future don't even exist. They're not realities.
That's fair. Okay, last question here. This one, I always love the answers for this. So it's a two-parter.
Okay.
If someone was to describe your superpower, what would that be? And then the second part of that question is, what do you wish your superpower would be? And it doesn't have to be like a comic book related superpower. It can be, of course, if you'd like.
What is my superpower? My superpower is to cut through all the stories and get to the root cause. I'm a fantastic listener, and I can like listen to like the stories the humans want to tell me. And I can pretty quickly get to like, what is the root cause problem of this? So yeah, I think that's what also makes me an exceptional coach. Um, and then the second part, what would I like my superpower to be? I wish I was more charismatic. You know, like those girls, like those like Instagram girls that are like everything's so happy and fun and they're like just so excited about everything. Like sometimes I wish I had more of that personality. That's like, because I have a thought that like that's more likable, right? Versus my like more direct personality, serious. So
That's fair. I mean, I think you have a little bit more of a likable personality that you realize. You're honestly really upbeat, especially throughout this whole interview here. And this is weirdly, it shouldn't be a high pressure situation, but they always feel like they are. Thus, when I look at my Whoop after this, I'm going to be sad. My Whoop's hated me for the past 4 months of having a baby. So at this point, I just laugh when I look at it. I'm like, yeah, okay. Of course I was stressed this hour. The kid woke up.
Right.
Of course I didn't get sleep.
I have a relationship with my freaking Garmin.
It used to concern me, but now I just chuckle at it. I'm like, all right. I was like, one, I don't know how accurate you are. Two, I mean, of course these things are happening. Like, can you give me tips on how to fix it? That'd be more helpful there. Whoop, like tell me what I need to do. And sometimes they actually do give you tips on that, which is cool. I don't know if your Garmin does that, but they actually give you little tips on the Whoop that says, okay, well, if you do this, this could help reduce that. Or this is why this is happening. So figure out what that is.
Yeah, that is helpful. Mine at the end of the day says, your stress levels are really high today. You should find some time to relax. Like, no shit.
Right. Like, thank you, Captain Obvious. You think I didn't realize I was stressed? Believe me, I'm here.
Right. Yeah.
But cool. All right. Well, with that, I don't really have any more questions. I just want to thank you so much for being on. It's been an amazing conversation. I'm going to have to re-listen to this like a couple of times because there's so much in here to digest. I think this is going to be a fantastic episode for people. It's not one that I've done before. So I'm very, very excited. I love to get smarter on neuroscience and how to regulate emotions. So I definitely want to reach out to you again to set up another call.
Cool.
But with that, I just want to thank everybody who will eventually be tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, we really appreciate if you could just hit the subscribe button, leave a detailed review. Tell me what you liked. Tell me what you'd like to learn more about. And of course, just check us out on Instagram at Everyday Elevations for some exclusive content and the latest updates, as well as I provide a little bit of peek behind the scenes. And then, Kimberly, how can they follow you and contact you?
Yeah. I have a website, KimberlyJarmanCoaching.com. And then I'm on IG at Kimberly Jarman Coaching. And I'm trying to be better at being on TikTok because that's where I like to be. And that's at Kimberly Jarman.
All right. Sweet. Well, thanks again for your time.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.